Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining us today because, wow, we are looking at a truly fascinating breakdown of the rapidly shifting tides in Australian politics. Recently, political commentator Topher Field sat down for this really in-depth interview to unpack some massive electoral upsets. And he's pointing to what he sees as a fundamental transformation in exactly how citizens are voting. So whether you follow the daily political grind religiously or, you just want to understand the bigger picture of where modern democracies might be heading, Field's analysis offers this highly structured, pretty provocative perspective. Let's break down his core arguments and see what on earth might be coming next. Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of Field's complex arguments, we'll be looking at shifting the political landscape, a cultural counter-revolution, the minority government era, rethinking immigration and labor, and finally, curing political apathy. Section 1. Shifting the political landscape, the seat of fur. So, to really understand this shift, Field points straight to a massive, recent upset in the regional seat of Farrer. We're talking about a coalition stronghold for 77 years that was just won by minor party candidate David Farley of One Nation. Field argues this monumental political shift, it isn't just your standard debate over policy tweaks. Major parties often think they can just lure voters back by shifting their position on a few minor issues. But Field firmly pushes back on that idea. He asserts that voters have actually made a deep, fundamental, moral choice. As he puts it right here, voters are looking at the major parties and asking, who hasn't lied to me? Name a politician who hasn't lied. According to his analysis, the electorate is just completely exhausted by broken promises. They're turning away from traditional allegiances, not just because of policy disagreements, but out of a genuine sense of constant betrayal. And the immediate mathematical consequence of that widespread voter frustration, it is honestly staggering. In this recent race, the coalition's combined primary vote absolutely plummeted to just 22%. To put that into perspective, that is down from 44% just 1 year earlier. It literally halved. Field points out that this is a complete collapse of brand value for the major parties in that region. Moving on to Section 2. A cultural counter-revolution, generational moral shifts. Here, Field scales his analysis all the way up to a macro-sociological level. He outlines this fascinating historical timeline of cultural shifts. He notes that, the 1950s were heavily characterized by the traditional nuclear family ideal, right? Then the 1960s brought the sexual revolution and free love, which was a direct rebellion against the dominant culture of the 50s. But here's where it gets interesting. Because that 1960s rebellion eventually became our modern dominant culture, Field theorizes that every culture inevitably breeds its own counterculture. He argues that the youth of the 2020s are actually actively rebelling against their parents' free love generation. They're basically reaching back into the cultural memory of their grandparents' era, and they're seeking out traditionalism and stability as the new form of modern rebellion. To back up this theory of a conservative counter-revolution, Field cites some very concrete societal trends. He points to studies indicating that younger generations are actually drinking less, taking fewer drugs, and engaging in less promiscuity. On top of that, he observes this rising skepticism toward the traditional university pathway. We're seeing more youth actively seeking out hands-on trades instead, and even a recent uptick in church attendance. It might sound completely counterintuitive, but Field views these behavioral changes as direct, hard evidence that younger demographics are totally rejecting modern societal norms in favor of older traditions. Which brings us to Section 3, the minority government era, the end of the two-party illusion. And this brilliantly illustrates Field's incredibly bold predictions about the structural future of Australian governance. He's fundamentally challenging the whole traditional two-party illusion. He predicts a highly fragmented geographical divide taking its place. Just picture this map. He foresees the Greens and Teal independents completely dominating inner-city areas. Labor, they'll likely control the middle suburbs. Minor parties like One Nation will dominate the vast regional and rural areas. And the Liberal Party, well, according to Field's analysis, they're going to find themselves severely squeezed into tiny little wedges in between, really struggling to find any definitive geographical stronghold. So, you might be wondering, how does a minor party actually leverage these regional wins into real federal power? Well, Field lays out a very specific strategic roadmap. Step 1, they need their newly elected members, like David Farley, to gain some crucial lower house experience. Learn the ropes. Step 2, they desperately need to attract high-profile defections from the major parties. Bringing seasoned politicians into their ranks right before an election builds immediate, undeniable credibility. And finally, Step 3, use those newly won seats to basically force a hung parliament, where a major party literally has to rely on them for supply guarantees just to form a minority government. But look, for this whole plan to work, the minor parties themselves have to mature. Take One Nation, for example. For decades, the party was functionally a dictatorship, with leader Pauline Hanson handpicking candidates and making all the executive decisions. But there has been a massive structural shift recently. Today, the party has established proper governance, installed a CEO, and really democratized its process. Take the seat of Ferrer again. Over 80 candidates were vetted, a shortlist was created, and the local party members actually voted to select David Farley. This kind of institutional maturation is exactly what's needed to attract serious donors and actually survive long-term.
Moving right into Section 4, Rethinking Immigration and Labor, Makers versus Takers.
Diving into specific policy analysis, Field categorizes the very heated immigration debate using two extremely distinct terms, takers and contributors. Now, according strictly to his economic philosophy, immigration contributors are those who arrive, work incredibly hard, and ultimately create more wealth and stability than they consume. Conversely, he defines immigration takers as those who are attracted to a country primarily to consume welfare and social services, ultimately taking far more out of the system than they ever put in.
To apply this to the real world, let's compare two very distinct realities in Australia right now. On one hand, regional Australia desperately needs agricultural labour. I mean, it is hard, hot, dusty work that quite frankly a lot of local Australians are just rejecting. For this, the argument goes, the country absolutely needs those immigrant contributors just to keep the food and fibre industries alive. On the other hand, there's a risk of operating an unrestricted welfare state that attracts those takers seeking easy money. The core argument he's making here is pretty simple. A nation's prosperity is guaranteed if its population creates more than it consumes, and poverty is absolutely guaranteed if the exact reverse is true. Which brings us to our final section. Section 5. Curing Political Apathy. Field's Call to Action.
After outlining all the ways the political landscape is basically fracturing, Field concludes that the real root cause of terrible governance isn't some shadowy backroom deals. It is simply widespread citizen apathy. He recites this ancient philosophical quote to really hammer his point home. The price you pay for not paying attention to politics is to be ruled by lesser men. He firmly believes that when everyday people just adopt the attitude of, that's not my problem, let someone else sort it out, they're directly responsible for allowing incompetent leaders who lack real-world experience to maintain power and continuously break their promises. So his ultimate call to action is a massive plea for engagement. He urges citizens to stop being apathetic, to finally get off the sidelines, pick a political party, and actively pay attention. He reminds us that sunlight is the absolute best disinfectant against political lies. If the electorate is actually engaged in watching closely, politicians simply cannot get away with the constant stream of broken promises that have defined recent decades. It's just that simple. And that brings us to the end of Topher Field's comprehensive analysis. From the shifting morals of younger generations to the strategic rise of minor parties and that ongoing debate over makers versus takers, the political ground is undoubtedly moving beneath our feet. But I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. Based on all this evidence, are we truly witnessing the permanent end of the two-party system in Australia? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on the data as this fascinating political landscape continues to unfold.